The Arizona sun dipped low over the Gila Valley in the spring of 1878, casting a warm glow across the rugged landscape where mesquite trees stood like silent sentinels against a sky ablaze with amber and rust. In the dusty outpost of Redstone, a stagecoach groaned to a halt, its wheels churning clouds of grit that danced in the fading light. From its door stepped Lila Monroe, a woman of 32, her auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a faded gray bonnet, her hazel eyes wide with a mix of hope and trepidation. In her gloved hands she clutched a letter, its edges frayed from a journey that had carried her from the green hills of Ohio to this sun-scorched corner of the frontier. Addressed to Mr. Caleb Warrick, it held the promise of a new life, a husband, a home, a future forged through ink and paper. Yet, as she stood in the empty street, no one was there to meet her. Lila's boots sank softly into the dirt, her gray cotton dress catching the warm breeze that swept through Redstone. The town was smaller than she'd imagined, a cluster of weathered buildings, a saloon with a tinny piano spilling notes into the air, a lone church steeple piercing the horizon. Men lounged on porches, their hats tipped low, their glances sharp but fleeting. A woman sweeping a doorstep paused, her eyes narrowing with curiosity, but no one offered a smile or a word of welcome. Layla's heart thudded, her fingers tightening around the letter. Caleb's words had been her anchor, kind, steady, filled with talk of a ranch under wide skies, a life they'd build together. She'd read them by candlelight in her Ohio boarding house, dreaming of a place to belong after years of loss. Now, standing alone, she felt like a page torn from someone else's story. She scanned the street, her bonnet shielding her eyes from the sun's glare. At its far end, a man leaned against a hitching post, his silhouette tall and lean, his weathered Stetson casting a shadow across his face. His denim shirt was rolled up to the elbows, revealing arms bronzed by years under the Arizona sun. Something in his stillness drew her, though her steps faltered with each stride. Layla swallowed her doubt and walked toward him, the letter trembling in her grip. "I'm looking for Caleb Warrick," she said, her voice clear despite the knot in her chest. The man lifted his head, revealing eyes the color of dark coffee, sharp yet guarded, set in a face lined by time and toil. He took the letter, his calloused fingers brushing hers, and read it slowly, his jaw tightening as if the words carried a weight he hadn't expected. "Caleb's gone," he said, his voice low and rough like the scrape of boots on gravel. "Died last month. Fever took him fast." The words struck Lila like a gust of desert wind, stealing her breath. Her gaze dropped to the dust, the letter suddenly heavy in her hands. The world seemed to blur, the promise she'd carried across. A continent crumbling like dry earth. She blinked, fighting the sting in her eyes, her mind grasping for something to hold on to. The man shifted, his hat tilting to reveal a flicker of regret in his expression. "I'm Gideon Warrick," he added, "his cousin." "I didn't know he'd sent for you, ma'am." Layla's throat tightened, words failing her. Caleb's letters, his hopes for a ranch, a family, they were gone, leaving her stranded in a town that didn't know her name. She clutched the letter. Its ink now, a ghost of a life that would never be. Gideon watched her, his silence heavy but not unkind. After a moment, he straightened, dusting his hands on his trousers. "There's a boarding house down the street," he said. "You can rest there tonight. Tomorrow I'll take you to the ranch if you want to see what's left of it." His offer was plain, almost reluctant, yet there was a steadiness in his voice that kept her from sinking entirely. Layla nodded, her voice lost, her fingers crumpling the letter's edge. What else could she do? Gideon led her to a squat adobe boarding house, its walls baked golden by the sun. The room he secured was sparse, a narrow bed with a patched quilt, a cracked wash basin, a single window framing the last light of day. Layla thanked him quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, and he tipped his hat before leaving his boots echoing on the wooden porch. Alone, she sat on the mattress, her bonnet in her lap, the letter beside her. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall in soft auburn waves, and stared at her hands. They were steady, but her heart raced, a storm of grief and uncertainty swirling within. Caleb was gone, and with him the future she'd dared to imagine. Yet Gideon's offer lingered, a thread of possibility in a world that had offered her none. She moved to the window, her fingers tracing the cool glass. Outside, Redstone settled into dusk, the saloon's lights flickering like stars against the darkening valley. A coyote's call echoed in the distance, sharp and lonely. Lila's thoughts drifted to Gideon, his guarded eyes, his rough voice. The way he'd looked at her letter as if it held more than words. He was a stranger, yet his offer to show her the ranch felt like more than duty. As she lay down, the letter crinkling beneath her pillow, Lila wondered what kind of man stood in Caleb's place, and what he saw when he looked at her. What secrets did Gideon Warrick hold, and why had he given a lost woman a reason to stay another day? The morning sun rose over the Gila Valley, its light filtering through a haze of dust that clung to the air like a memory. In Redstone, Arizona, the boarding house where Lila Monroe had spent her first night stood quiet, its adobe walls glowing faintly in the dawn. Lila woke to the sound of a creaking floorboard, her auburn hair loose across the pillow, her hazel eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling. The letter to Caleb Warrick lay on the bedside table, its words now a hollow echo of a life that wasn't hers. She rose, smoothing her gray cotton dress, and pinned her hair beneath her bonnet, her movements deliberate but heavy with uncertainty. Today, Gideon Warrick had promised to take her to the ranch, Caleb's ranch, though she wasn't sure what she'd find there, or why she'd agreed to go. Downstairs, the boarding house keeper, a wiry woman with a sharp gaze, served Lila a plate of cornbread and coffee. "You're the one who came for Caleb," the woman said, her tone more curious than kind. Lila nodded, her fingers tightening around her mug. "He didn't tell anyone he was expecting you," the woman added, then turned away, leaving Lila to her thoughts. The coffee was bitter, but it steadied her. She hadn't come all this way to crumble, though the weight of Caleb's absence pressed hard against her chest. Outside, the town was stirring, horses clopped past. A blacksmith's hammer rang in the distance, but it felt distant. Like a world she didn't yet belong to, Gideon appeared at the door, his tall frame filling the threshold, his Stetson pulled low. His denim shirt was clean but worn, his dark coffee eyes scanning the room before settling on her. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low, carrying the same steady roughness as the night before. Lila stood, brushing crumbs from her dress, and followed him into the street. The sun was climbing now, warming the air, and Gideon's horse, a sturdy bay mare, waited by the hitching post. He offered her a hand to mount a second horse, a chestnut gelding, but Lila climbed up herself, her movements practiced from years of necessity. Gideon's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but a flicker of respect crossed his face. The ride to the ranch was long, the trail winding through scrubby hills dotted with cactus and sagebrush. Dust rose beneath the horse's hooves, coating Lila's bonnet and skirt, but she didn't mind. It felt honest, like the land was claiming her in small ways. Gideon rode ahead, his posture relaxed but alert, his silence not unkind but heavy with thoughts he didn't share. Lila watched him, noting the way his hands held the reins firm, but gentle, like a man who knew the weight of responsibility. "How long did you know Caleb?" she asked, breaking the quiet. Gideon glanced back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "All my life," he said. "He was more brother than cousin. Always had big plans, too big sometimes." Lila nodded, her throat tight. Caleb's letters had been full of those plans, a ranch, cattle, a family. She'd believed in them, enough to leave everything behind. "Did he ever mention me?" she asked, her voice softer than she meant. Gideon's jaw tightened, and he looked away, toward the horizon. "Not in so many words," he said. "But he talked about a future, someone to share it with. I reckon that was you." The words were simple, but they stirred something in Lila. Mix of grief and curiosity. Who had Caleb been, and why hadn't Gideon known about her? The Warrick ranch came into view, a modest spread of adobe and wood nestled against a low hill. A single chair sat on the porch, its paint peeling, and a weathered barn stood nearby, its door creaking in the breeze. A well, its stones worn smooth, marked the center of the yard. The place felt empty, like a house holding its breath. Gideon dismounted, tying the horses, and gestured for Lila to follow. "This was his," he said, his voice flat but not cold. "Yours now, I suppose, if you want it." Lila stepped onto the porch, her boots echoing on the wood. The air smelled of dust and dried grass, and the silence of the ranch pressed against her, heavy with loss. Inside, the house was sparse but clean: a table, a stove, a narrow bed with a faded quilt. Lila's fingers brushed the table's edge, imagining Caleb there, writing the letters that had brought her across a continent. Gideon stood by the door, his hat in his hands, watching her with an intensity that made her pause. "You don't have to decide now," he said. "Stay here tonight or back at the boarding house. I'll come by tomorrow." His offer was plain, but there was a weight to it, as if he were offering more than just time. Lila met his gaze, her hazel eyes searching his. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gideon hesitated, his fingers tightening on his hat. "Caleb would have wanted it," he said, but his eyes lingered on her a moment too long, betraying something unspoken. He turned to leave, his boots crunching on the porch, but paused at the door. "Get some rest, Miss Monroe," he said, his voice softer now. "This land's got a way of talking if you listen." Lila watched him go, the dust settling behind him as he rode away. Alone in the quiet house, she sat at the table, the letter in her hands, her heart torn between grief and a flicker of something new. What did Gideon mean by the land's voice, and what truths was he keeping from her? The Arizona dawn broke over the Gila Valley, its light spilling across the sagebrush and casting long shadows over the Warrick ranch. Lila Monroe woke to the faint creak of the adobe house settling, her auburn hair tangled from a restless night. On the narrow bed, the letter to Caleb Warrick sat untouched on the table, its words a silent reminder of a life that had slipped through her fingers. She rose, smoothing her gray cotton dress, and pinned her hair beneath her bonnet, her hazel eyes catching the soft glow of sunrise through the window. The ranch was quiet, save for the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of wind through mesquite trees. Lila felt its solitude like a second skin, yet something about the place, its stark simplicity, its stubborn endurance, stirred a resolve in her she hadn't expected. She stepped into the kitchen, where a small stove stood cold. A basket of cornbread, left by Gideon the night before, sat on the table, its edges wrapped in a faded cloth. The gesture, small but deliberate, warmed her more than she cared to admit. She broke off a piece, its texture rough but comforting, and brewed a pot of coffee, the aroma grounding her in the unfamiliar space. As she sipped, her thoughts drifted to Gideon, his guarded coffee-brown eyes, his quiet offer to show her this place. He was a stranger, yet his presence lingered like the scent of sage after a rain, steady and unintrusive. Outside, the crunch of boots announced Gideon's arrival. He stood on the porch, his Stetson tipped low, his denim shirt rolled up to the elbows, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. "Morning, Miss Monroe," he said, his voice low but clear, carrying the weight of the desert air. "Thought I'd check the fences today. You're welcome to come along or stay here." Lila hesitated, her fingers brushing the letter on the table. She wasn't ready to call this place hers, but she wasn't ready to leave it either. "I'll come," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She grabbed her shawl, its cream fabric soft against her shoulders, and followed him into the morning light. They walked the ranch's perimeter, the sun climbing higher, warming the dust beneath their feet. Gideon moved with purpose, inspecting sagging posts and rusted wire, his hands deft as he tightened a loose knot. Lila kept pace, her boots stirring small clouds of dirt, her eyes tracing the vastness of the valley. The land was harsh cactus. Spines glinted, rocks jutted like old bones, but it had a beauty, raw and unyielding. "Caleb loved this place," Gideon said, breaking the silence as he hammered a nail into a post. "Said it had a heart if you knew where to look." Lila glanced at him, catching a flicker of grief in his eyes. "Did you love it too?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Gideon paused, his hammer resting against the fence. "Still do," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But it's a hard kind of love. Takes more than it gives, most days." His words hung between them, heavy with truth. Lila nodded, her thoughts drifting to her own losses, parents gone too soon, a life in Ohio that had never fit. "I know. That kind, she said quietly, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. Gideon looked at her, his eyes searching as if seeing her for the first time. For a moment, the silence felt different, not empty, but shared. Like a breath held together, they returned to the house for a simple lunch: beans, cornbread, and water from the well. The table was small, the chairs creaking under their weight, but the meal felt like a ritual, grounding them in the moment. Gideon ate slowly, his movements deliberate, his eyes occasionally meeting hers. "You don't have to stay," he said, setting down his spoon. "This place, it's not what Caleb promised you. There's a stagecoach to Tucson tomorrow if you want it." Lila's heart tightened. The idea of leaving was tempting, but the thought of staying, of facing this land with its quiet strength, pulled harder. "I'm not ready to go," she said, her voice firm. "Not yet." Gideon nodded, his expression unreadable but not unkind. He rose, gathering their plates, and paused by the door. "I'll be in the barn tonight," he said. "If you need anything, just holler." Lila watched him go, his silhouette framed against the midday sun, his steps steady but heavy. She moved to the porch, her hands resting on the peeling chair, and looked out at the ranch. The land stretched wide, its silence both daunting and inviting. She thought of Caleb's letters, of Gideon's words about the land's heart. He hadn't pressed her to decide, hadn't asked about her past, but his quiet presence was weaving itself into her thoughts. Steady as the rhythm of the desert dot as she stood there, a faint breeze carried the scent of sage, and Lila felt a stirring. Within her, a sense that this place, this moment, held more than loss. Gideon's offer to stay wasn't just about the ranch, it was an invitation to something deeper, something she couldn't yet name. What was it about this man that made her want to linger, and what truths lay hidden in the heart of this land? The Gila Valley shimmered under a relentless midday sun, its heat weaving a haze over the sagebrush and sunbaked clay, where the scent of dust mingled with the faint sweetness of desert blooms. At the Warrick Ranch in Redstone, Arizona, Lila Monroe stood on the weathered porch, her auburn hair loosely pinned beneath her gray bonnet, strands catching the breeze like whispers of her past. Her hazel eyes traced the horizon, where mesquite trees stood stark against a cloudless sky, their shadows stretching long and lean. Her gray cotton dress, now dusted with the ranch's red earth, clung lightly to her frame, the hem frayed from days of chores sweeping the adobe floors, scrubbing the stove, hauling water from the well. The ranch, with its peeling paint and silent corners, was no longer just Caleb's, beginning to feel like hers. Though she couldn't say why, inside the kitchen was warm, the air heavy with the scent of coffee and cornbread left from breakfast. Lila's fingers brushed the letter to Caleb Warrick, still on the table. Its ink faded like a dream she'd carried from Ohio. She hadn't opened it since arriving. But its presence anchored her, a reminder of the life she'd lost and the one she might yet find. Her thoughts drifted to Gideon Warrick, his coffee-brown eyes, guarded but kind, his voice rough yet steady, like the rhythm of the land itself. His quiet offer to show her the ranch had been more than duty, she sensed, though she wasn't ready to name what lay beneath it. She shook her head, pushing the thought away, and tied her cream shawl around her shoulders. Stepping outside to face the day, the crunch of boots announced Gideon's return, his horse kicking up dust that glittered in the sunlight. He dismounted, his tall frame moving with a quiet strength, his Stetson tilted low to shade his face. His denim shirt was rolled to the elbows, revealing arms bronzed by years under the Arizona sun, and a leather satchel hung across his chest, its strap worn but sturdy. "Morning, Miss Monroe," he said, his voice carrying the desert's roughness. "Fence out back sagging worse than yesterday. Could use some help if you're willing?" Lila met his gaze, her heart quickening at the invitation. "Not just to work, but to share in something real." "I'm willing," she said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty within. She followed him to the back of the ranch, her boots stirring small clouds of dust. The air warm against her skin, the fence was a patchwork of splintered posts and rusted wire, leaning under the weight of time and neglect. Gideon handed her a pair of cracked leather gloves, his fingers brushing hers briefly, sending a spark through her she didn't expect. He showed her how to hold the wire taut while he hammered nails, his movements precise, almost graceful. Lila worked beside him, her hands clumsy at first but finding a rhythm, mirroring his steady pace. Sweat beaded on her brow as she wiped it with her sleeve, catching Gideon's glance a flicker of approval, perhaps admiration. "You're stronger than you look," he said, his tone light but carrying a warmth that made her pause. "Lila's." Lips curved into a half-smile, rare and unguarded. "Ohio winters teach you to hold your own," she replied, her voice soft but sure. Gideon chuckled, a low, warm sound that seemed to soften the harshness of the valley. "Caleb used to say this land was like that," he said, driving a nail with a single swing. "Tough but fair. Break you if you don't fight for it." Lila glanced at him, her hazel eyes curious, searching the lines of his weathered face. "And you?" she asked. "What do you fight for, Gideon?" His hammer stilled, his gaze drifting to the distant hills, where the sun cast shadows like ripples on water. "Keeping things alive," he said after a long pause. "The ranch. The cattle, Caleb's dreams. Maybe mine too, a long time ago?" His words carried a quiet grief, a glimpse of a man shaped by loss yet tethered to this land. Lila nodded, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. She knew that kind of fight, her own losses, a family gone too soon, a life in Ohio that had never fit. "I've fought for less," she said softly, almost to herself. "But I'm still here." Gideon looked at her, his coffee-brown eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary, as if seeing her anew. The silence between them felt different now, not heavy, but shared like a secret they hadn't yet spoken. They finished the fence as the sun began its descent, painting the valley in hues of gold and crimson. Back at the house, Lila set out a supper of beans, cornbread, and coffee, the table creaking under their plates. They ate in a comfortable silence, the clink of mugs and the crackle of the stove filling the space. Gideon's eyes lingered on her hands, now roughened by work, and Lila felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "You don't owe me this," she said, breaking the quiet. "The ranch, the hell penny of it." Gideon leaned back, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "Maybe I don't," he said. "But Caleb would have wanted someone to look out for you, and it ain't a burden." His words, plain but weighted, stirred something in Lila gratitude. Curiosity, a spark she wasn't ready to name as she cleared the plates. Gideon reached into his satchel, pulling out a folded bundle of cotton fabric, blue as the desert sky at dusk. He set it on the table, his movements deliberate. "For the work around here," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Thought it might suit you." Lila's fingers paused on a dish, her eyes on the fabric. It was simple, sturdy, but it felt like more than a practicality tie to this place, to him. She dried her hands, touching the cloth lightly, its texture promising a future she hadn't dared imagine. Gideon stood, moving to the door but paused, his hand on the frame. "You're doing all right, Lila," he said, her name soft on his lips, a sound that lingered like the valley's breeze. "Sleep well." He stepped into the evening, his silhouette fading into the dusk. Lila stood alone in the kitchen, the blue fabric in her hands, her heart beating with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. The ranch was becoming hers, not just Caleb's, and Gideon's quiet presence was weaving itself into her days steady as the desert's pulse. What was it about this man's unspoken kindness that made her want to stay, and what secrets was he holding back in the shadows of his gaze? The Gila Valley lay bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, its sagebrush and mesquite swaying gently under a sky streaked with clouds like brushstrokes of fire. At the Warrick Ranch in Redstone, Arizona, Lila Monroe stood by the well, her auburn hair tied back with a blue ribbon, a few strands clinging to her sun-warmed cheeks. Her new blue cotton dress, the one Gideon had left on the table, hugged her frame, its hem dusted with the red earth of the ranch. She hauled a bucket of water, her hands stronger now, calloused from days of work mending fences, scrubbing floors, tending the small patch of herbs she'd planted by the porch. The ranch no longer felt like a stranger's home. It was weaving itself into her bones. Much like the man who'd brought her here. Inside the adobe house, the kitchen was warm, a scent of simmering beans and fresh cornbread filling the air. Lila set the table for two, her hazel eyes lingering. on the chair where Gideon sat each evening. The letter to Caleb Warrick, once her anchor, now rested in a drawer, its promises fading as new ones took root. She thought of Gideon, his coffee-brown eyes, steady yet shadowed, his quiet gestures that spoke louder than words. The blue dress, the gloves he'd given her, the way he'd called her name, they were threads in a tapestry she hadn't expected to weave. Yet doubt lingered, a whisper in her heart. Could she trust this land, this man, with the fragile hope growing within her? The sound of hooves broke her thoughts. Gideon rode into the yard, his Stetson low, his denim shirt dusted with the day's work. He dismounted, tying his bay mare to the post, his leather satchel slung across his chest, its strap worn from years of use. "Evening, Lila," he said, his voice rough but warm, carrying the desert's cadence. He paused on the porch, wiping his boots, and met her gaze through the open door. "Smells good in there," he added, a rare half-smile tugging at his lips. Layla's heart quickened, her fingers smoothing her dress. "Supper's ready," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Come in before it gets cold?" They sat at the table, the creak of chairs and clink of spoons a familiar rhythm now. The meal was simple beans, cornbread, coffee, but it felt like more, a quiet ritual binding them to this place, to each other. Gideon ate slowly, his eyes occasionally meeting hers, their coffee-brown depths holding a warmth she hadn't noticed. "Before you're settling in," he said, breaking the silence, his tone thoughtful. "The ranch looks alive again." Layla's fingers paused on her mug, her hazel eyes searching his. "It's hard work," she said. "But it feels right, like I'm not just passing through anymore." Gideon nodded, his gaze lingering, as if her words had stirred something deep within him. After supper, Layla cleared the plates, her movements brisk to hide the flush in her cheeks. Gideon rose, pulling a small object from his satchel, a carved wooden spoon, its handle worn smooth, etched with a faint pattern of stars. He set it on the table, his fingers lingering on its edge. "Found this in the barn," he said, his voice low. "Caleb's mother made it years ago. Thought you might use it." Layla's breath caught, her fingers brushing the spoon's surface. It was more than a tool, it was a piece of this ranch, its history, offered to her like a bridge to a past she hadn't known. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes meeting his. Holding a question she wasn't ready to ask, they stepped onto the porch. The evening air cooling the valley, the sky now a deep indigo dotted with stars. Lila leaned against the railing, her shawl draped over her shoulders, the blue dress catching the faint moonlight. Gideon stood beside her, his hat in his hands, his silhouette strong against the darkening landscape. "You asked me once what I fight for," he said, his voice soft but weighted. "Truth is, I stopped fighting for much after Caleb's mother passed. Then Caleb, but this ranch, you being here, it's making me think I might have something left to hold on to." His words hung in the air, raw and unguarded, and Lila's heart thudded, a spark igniting within her. She turned to him, her hazel eyes bright in the starlight. "I don't know what I'm fighting for yet," she admitted, her voice trembling but honest. "But I'm not running anymore. Not from this place or you." Gideon's gaze softened, his fingers tightening on his hat, as if her words had anchored him to the moment. For a heartbeat, the space between them felt alive, charged with possibility. He stepped closer, his breath warm in the cool air, but stopped short, as if afraid to cross an invisible line. "Get some rest, Lila," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "We've got work tomorrow." He turned toward the barn, his boots crunching on the dirt, but paused halfway, glancing back. Layla stood frozen, her hands gripping her shawl, her heart racing with a truth she couldn't yet name. She returned to the kitchen, the wooden spoon still on the table, its stars glinting in the lamplight. The ranch was becoming her home, and Gideon's presence was more than a duty, it was a promise, unspoken but growing stronger each day. As she lay down, the stars visible through her window, Layla felt the valley's quiet strength seeping into her, binding her to this land, to him. What was it about Gideon's confession that made her heart dare to hope, and what would happen if they both stopped holding back? The Gila Valley glowed under the soft light of a late spring dusk, its mesquite trees casting delicate shadows across the red earth, where the air held the lingering warmth of day and the promise of a cool night. At the Warrick Ranch in Redstone, Arizona, Lila Monroe knelt in her small herb garden, her auburn hair tied back with a blue ribbon, a few strands clinging to her sun-kissed cheeks. Her blue cotton dress, a gift from Gideon, was dusted with soil, its hem catching the breeze as she pressed thyme seedlings into the ground. Her hands, now strong and calloused, moved with care, as if tending the earth could root her own unsteady heart. The ranch had become more than a shelter, it was a home, its adobe walls and creaking porch weaving themselves into her days. Much like the man who shared them, inside the house, the kitchen hummed with the scent of simmering stew and fresh cornbread. The table set for two with the carved wooden spoon Gideon had given her resting beside her plate. Lila's hazel eyes lingered on it, its star-etched handle a quiet reminder of the ranch's history, and of Gideon's gesture simple but heavy, with meaning. The letter to Caleb Warrick, once her lifeline, lay forgotten in a drawer, its promises eclipsed by the life she was building here. Yet a shadow of doubt lingered. Could she trust this fragile hope, this land, this man who'd stirred her heart, in ways she hadn't thought possible? She stood, brushing dirt from her dress, and gazed out the window where the valley stretched wide. Its beauty raw and unyielding, the sound of hooves broke the quiet, and Gideon Warrick rode into the yard. His Stetson low, his denim shirt rolled to the elbows, dust clinging to his leather satchel. He dismounted with a quiet grace, tying his bay marais to the post, and paused to wipe his brow, his coffee-brown eyes catching hers through the open door. "Evening, Lila," he said, his voice rough but warm like the desert wind at twilight. He stepped onto the porch, his boots scraping softly, and leaned against the railing, his gaze lingering on her garden. "That patch is coming along," he said, a rare half-smile softening his weathered face. Lila's heart lifted, her fingers smoothing her dress. "It's a start," she said. "Something to leave behind, maybe." Her words held a question she didn't voice, and Gideon's eyes met hers. Steady and searching, they sat down to supper, the creak of chairs and clink of spoons a familiar melody now. The stew was hearty, the cornbread golden, and the coffee bitter but grounding. Gideon ate slowly, his movements deliberate, his eyes occasionally drifting to Lila's hands, now marked by the ranch's labor. "You've changed this place," he said, breaking the silence, his tone thoughtful. "The ranch, it's got life again." Caleb would have been proud. Lila's throat tightened, her hazel eyes meeting his. "I'm not doing it for Caleb," she said softly, her voice honest but vulnerable. "I'm doing it for me, and maybe for us." The words slipped out, unguarded, and the air between them shifted, charged with a truth neither had dared to speak. Gideon set down his spoon, his fingers tracing the edge of the table as if anchoring himself. "Us," he repeated, his voice low, almost a whisper. "That's a word I haven't thought about in a long time." He leaned back, his coffee-brown eyes raw with something Lila couldn't name, grief, hope, or both. "After Caleb's mother passed, then him, I figured I'd live out my days alone. This ranch was all I had left, but you being here, it's making me question that." His confession hung in the air, heavy with vulnerability, and Lila's heart thudded, a spark igniting within her. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the space between them, but fear held her back, not of him, but of the hope that felt so fragile. After supper, they moved to the porch, the valley now cloaked in indigo, stars blinking awake above the distant hills. Lila leaned against the railing, her cream shawl draped over her shoulders, the blue dress catching the moonlight. Gideon stood beside her, his hat in his hands, his silhouette strong yet softened by the night. He pulled a small object from his satchel, a folded photograph, its edges worn, showing two young men standing shoulder to shoulder, one smiling broadly, the other more reserved. "Caleb and me," he said, his voice low. "Took it years ago, before things changed." Lila took the photo, her fingers brushing his, and studied it, seeing Gideon's younger face, less guarded but already carrying a quiet strength. "You?" "We're close," she said, her voice soft. Gideon nodded, his gaze on the stars. "He was the dreamer," he said. I was the one who kept things standing. Never thought I'd be the one left behind. He turned to her, his eyes holding hers, raw and unguarded. You've got dreams, Lila. I see it in the way you work this place. Don't let them die here. His words struck her, a mix of encouragement and something deeper, a plea she felt in her bones. She handed the photo back, her fingers lingering near his. I'm not letting them die, she said, her voice steady but trembling. I'm planting them right here. For a moment, the world seemed to still, the valley's silence wrapping around them like a vow. Gideon stepped closer, his breath warm in the cool air, his hand hovering near hers on the railing. Lila's heart raced, her hazel eyes locked on his, the space between them alive with possibility. But he pulled back, his jaw tightening as if wrestling with something unspoken. Good night, Lila, he said, his voice low, almost pained. He turned toward the barn, his boots crunching on the dirt, but glanced back once, his silhouette framed against the starlit valley. Lila stood frozen, her hands gripping her shawl, her heart torn between fear and a longing she could no longer deny. Inside, she sat at the table, the photograph and wooden spoon before her, their weight more than their size. She traced the stars on the spoon's handle, her thoughts swirling with Gideon's words, his gaze, the almost touch that lingered. Like a promise. The ranch was her home now, and Gideon was more than its keeper. He was the heart of this place, steady and true. As she lay down, the stars bright through her window, Lila felt the desert's pulse echoing her own, binding her to this land. To him. What was it about Gideon's unspoken vow that made her want to stay forever? And what would happen if they both dared to cross that line? The Gila Valley bloomed under the tender light of early summer, its sagebrush and mesquite alive with the hum of bees and the soft rustle of a warm breeze. At the Warrick Ranch in Redstone, Arizona, Lila Monroe stood in her herb garden, now lush. With thyme and rosemary, her auburn hair tied with a blue ribbon, strands catching the sunlight like threads of copper. Her blue cotton dress, worn soft from months of work, swayed as she knelt to pull weeds, her hands strong and sure, marked by the ranch's red earth. The adobe house behind her stood proud, its porch adorned with a new swing, crafted by Gideon's hands, creaking gently in the wind. This place was no longer just a shelter, it was her home, its rhythms woven into her heart, alongside the man who'd made it so. Inside, the kitchen glowed with the scent of roasting venison and fresh cornbread, a table set for two with the star-etched wooden spoon beside Lila's plate, a quiet testament to the ranch's past and her place in its future. The letter to Caleb Warrick, once her tether to a lost dream, had been tucked away in a drawer, its ink faded as new promises took root. Lila's hazel eyes traced the room, the quilt she'd sewn, the shelf holding Caleb's photograph, the faint scent of sage drifting through the open window. She thought of Gideon, his coffee-brown eyes steady yet warm, his quiet strength that had anchored her through months of doubt. Their bond, born of shared silences and small gestures, had grown into something deeper, a love she hadn't dared imagine until now. The clop of hooves announced Gideon's return, his silhouette tall against the golden valley as he rode in, his Stetson low, his denim shirt dusted with the day's labor. He dismounted, tying his bay marais, his leather satchel slung across his chest, and paused to survey the garden, a rare smile softening his weathered face. "Looking good, Lila," he said, his voice rough but warm, carrying the desert's cadence. He stepped onto the porch, his boots scraping softly, and leaned against the swing, his coffee-brown eyes meeting hers. "Supper ready?" he asked, a teasing note in his tone. Lila's heart lifted, her fingers smoothing her dress. "Waiting on you," she replied, her voice light but carrying a warmth that matched his. They sat down to eat, the creak of chairs and clink of mugs a melody of their shared life. The venison was tender, the cornbread golden, and the coffee rich, grounding them in the moment. Gideon's eyes lingered on Lila, his gaze softer now, unguarded in a way it hadn't been before. "A year ago, this place was empty," he said, his voice low, thoughtful. "Now it's full, because of you." Lila's throat tightened, her hazel eyes bright with emotion. "Not just me," she said softly. "Us, this is ours, Gideon." The words hung between them, a vow unspoken but felt, and Gideon's hand paused on his mug, his fingers trembling slightly, as if her words had stirred a truth he'd long buried. After supper they moved to the porch swing, the valley now cloaked in twilight, stars blooming like promises in the indigo sky. Lila sat close to Gideon, her cream shawl draped over her shoulders, the blue dress catching the moonlight. He pulled a small object from his satchel, a silver ring, simple and worn, its surface etched with a faint pattern of vines. "Belonged to my mother," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "Caleb always said I'd find someone to give it to. Never thought he'd be right." He held it out, not pressing, but offering, his coffee-brown eyes raw with hope and fear. Layla's breath caught, her fingers brushing his as she took the ring, its weight warm and honest in her palm. She looked at him, her hazel eyes glistening in the starlight. "I came here for a stranger's promise," she said, her voice steady but trembling. "But I'm staying for yours, for us." She slid the ring onto her finger, its fit imperfect but true, and Gideon's hand closed over hers, his touch gentle but firm, anchoring them to the moment. For the first time they didn't pull back, their hands entwined, the swing creaking softly beneath them. The valley seemed to hold its breath, its silence a blessing on the life they'd built rooted in loss, but blooming with love. Months passed, and the ranch thrived under their care. Layla's garden grew lush, its herbs scenting the air, while Gideon's cattle roamed stronger than ever. They added a new room to the house, not for guests, but for a future they now dared to dream. Neighbors stopped by, drawn by the warmth of the Warrick ranch, and Redstone's whispers of the mail-order bride faded, replaced by tales of Lila and Gideon's quiet love. One evening, as they sat on the swing, the ring glinting on Lila's finger, Gideon spoke, his voice soft but sure. "Caleb brought you here," he said, "but you stayed for me. I'll spend my life thanking you for that." Layla leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, the valley stretching before them like a canvas of hope. "We built this together," she said, her voice warm with certainty. Their love, born of chance and nurtured by courage, was a testament to the frontier's enduring spirit, a reminder that even in the harshest lands, second chances could take root and flourish. This story, woven from the heart of the American West, teaches us that love and resilience can grow where least expected, much like the homesteaders who carved lives from the desert's edge. If this tale of hope and home warmed your heart, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more frontier stories that remind us to keep dreaming.